Welcome, everyone. This is When Words Collide 2020, the COVID version, hence our little buddy up there on top of the logo. And we're hoping to see Bob Stallworthy make an appearance. He's a little late coming in, but we're still hopeful he'll show up. And in the meantime, so this is Birth of a Poet. And I think, well, at least in my mind, and I could be wrong, but I think becoming a writer is one thing, but I think acknowledging at some point that you're a poet and a writer is sort of a combo dealio. And I don't know, is it the same thing? Is it something different? I mean, is it different than, say, becoming a novelist? Like, for instance, Shawn, I guess maybe, do you want to start?
Sure. My first writing was poetry. I won a poetry prize in grade 4, and so I totally thought I was a poet from the time I was like 9. But then, and I wrote poetry, as my coping mechanism all through high school, and people would steal my notebooks and put my poems on the bulletin boards at high school, and just to mortify me. So I've done that poetry thing for a long time, but then I took a long break, and I was busy at university doing my school stuff and whatever. And I had my novel Grace Awakening done, and I have this web page that has 300 poems a year. I put up a new poem for a while. I was putting a new one up every day for 4 years or 5 years. And I still didn't have on my business card poet. And that was a big deal to suddenly go, wait, also, if I write this much poetry, I better acknowledge that I'm also a poet. So now it says novelist and poet, or author and poet. And it was a definite switch in my brain from a creative acknowledgement. So acknowledging you're a writer is kind of, lots of people write, but to acknowledge that poetic side and that poetic vision and poetic lifestyle was a step. It definitely was a step.
So, Amy, what was your discovery in becoming a poet? How did it happen to you? Was it, oh, I'm a writer, or I'm a poet, or what happened first, or was it a combo?
So for me, it was kind of a combination. I had written my whole life. I was mostly a short story writer, hoped to be a novelist. And then, I don't know, poetry was just kind of what I found my real comfort with. And then I found, kind of like Shawn, you were talking about like writing poetry in high school. What I was drawn to when I wanted to write something was usually poetry first. And at a certain point, I had to acknowledge that this is my form that I would choose over everything else to start with. So I don't know. And I still consider myself a writer and a poet. I still write fiction as well as poetry. But I don't know. I feel like the time that I spend writing poetry is what feeds me more maybe than the time that I spend writing fiction. I love them both, but I don't know. I think poetry is always the first love. So there's always just that drawback to it. So yeah, a little bit of both for me, definitely.
And Sandra, what about for you? Was it first the poetry, or was it the writing that came first? And it sounds funny, I know that writing and poetry are the same thing, but I think somehow it is different.
Yeah, actually, I just saw a note on the chat from Bob. He may have come in on the regular thing, so you may want to let him in and promote him. But I started writing poetry as a experiment, and that was when I started writing, which is actually not a huge amount of time ago, as glaciers are considered. But I really wanted to try writing a story in different modes. So I did some poems that were also short stories, and looking at the difference in how the
Yes.
storytelling was possible. So there's been a lot of things that way. I do write poetry. My first actual publication was in '98, and the next one was 30 years later. But because I've used poetry in some of my novels to express how a person felt, that they actually started writing poetry. So then I had to write the poem that expressed how they were feeling, which was kind of weird, but it worked. So yeah, I don't specifically think of myself as a poet, but as a writer who sometimes does poetry. So
it is sort of distinct. Poetry and writing somehow separate themselves out.
I certainly don't write a lot of poetry, not like Shawn or possibly Amy, but I do some, and I found it very, as a structural thing. Other than a few emotional poems, they tend to be poems that tell a story, and as opposed to sort of the old style, perhaps, of poetry where it's the bards of old, where the druid bards would be out there and they would tell stories as poems, and that's more my style. Although I have done one about the stranger in my bed, which is more of a modern style of poetry, and it's an encounter early in the morning.
Okay, help me out here. I'm just trying to get Bob in here. Oh, there you are, Bob. Sorry about that. Okay, let's get you in here. There you are.
Will add to Sandra's. My first novel was the same. I had quite a bit of poetry in it. So one of the characters wrote a poem, and it was actually a poem that I had written when I was 12. So I actually, I had been told to send it to a magazine, and I did. And then the magazine wrote me back. It was my first rejection letter, and they told me it was too adult a poem for their children's poetry magazine. And so, I was so angry. I didn't submit anything anywhere for 8 years. So that's, one rejection and 8 years of, then fine, I'm not sharing my stuff. Which sounds like a 12-year-old's reaction, really. And, but that poem ended up in Grace Awakening. So I kind of think, I got the last word, because it did get published eventually. And there were also several other different more formal poems in that book, including Greek metrical poetry stanzas all the way through as chapter openers, which I like, my editor liked, but the Whistler Independent Book Awards didn't like.
Yes, I remember this panel that not only do you have to face rejection, but after you get published, you get reviews that could be potentially hurtful. So I just want to do an update here. Bob, we've enabled you to talk. I'm not sure why the Zoom invite didn't work, so we're not getting a visual, but if you want to just say hello.
Hello.
Yay.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Good.
So can you tell us at what moment in your life you said, oh, I'm a poet, or am I a writer, or what?
Well, I don't make a distinction between the two to start with. I am a writer. I write poetry, among other things, but I am a writer of poetry. So I don't make that distinction at all. And I guess the moment I became a poet probably was about 3 years or so after I started to write at all. And I was not somebody who wrote from the age of 3. I didn't start writing seriously until I was in my late 30s, I guess. Perhaps even, my late 30s. And well, I can see my name now. Hang on. There we go.
Yay.
Yay. I got a poem published about 3 years after I'd started. And I also heard a writer who is no longer with us, a guy by the name of Martin Godfrey, who was a children's young adult writer, giving a talk to a high school group. And he said, one of the things you need to know is that if you write on a regular basis, and if you send that material out to magazines or publishers, whatever, then you are a writer. And for the first time in my writing career, I stopped digging my toe in the dirt and muttering something about maybe being a writer when somebody asked me what I did. So I guess that's probably the point, that I became serious about it anyway. But I'd been doing it for years, and not knowing what I was doing at all, of course. I was sitting in my basement writing poems by the gallon, and none of them getting published. Good thing. But
at what point did you sort of get up and say, it's time to get these published?
Well, I guess I went at it slightly differently. First of all, writing didn't pick me. I picked writing as something I thought I might do. I had done a little bit of it in school, and that sort of whet my appetite. But I approached it sort of from the point of view of, I wonder if I could. So for the first year, maybe even 2, it was, I wonder if I can write a poem, any poem. And I wrote 70 of them the first year. At least I called them poems. I'm not sure anybody else did, but I did. And I wrote 50 the second year. And then I started taking workshops and things. But it was sort of, well, I wonder, now that I've written a poem, or sort of have anyway, I wonder if I could get one published. And then it was, I wonder if I could get another one published. And so I eventually, of course, I sort of stood up and said, gee, I am publishing poetry, and I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. But I never actually came at it sort of in that much of an aggressive way. It was the same thing with a book. I wonder if I could write enough poems to put in a book.
What was that crossing point for you, Shawn? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Somewhere around 2015, I think, is when I added it to my business card, and I already had a book and poetry published, and hundreds and hundreds of poems on my blog published, and a book. So it was weird, to not think about it in terms of a separate writing identity, because I wrote so much poetry and always write so much poetry. So I was 50 probably around the time that I actually acknowledged it out loud. Hey, I am also a poet.
Yeah, it's the new 30 coming in. Amy, so what was your crossing over point?
I think for me, my crossing over point, I was fortunate enough 2 years ago to go to the Banff Center for an Emerging Writers week-long writing intensive, where I just got to meet some amazing people. And I had a moment there, I had a lot of moments just getting to know these people that were at the same point in their careers as I was, that are on the same age, just kind of starting out in this. And it was at the Bounce Center that I started putting together what would ultimately be my first collection, which just got published a couple months ago.
Right.
And I think it was just, there was something about being in that space and being surrounded by all of these writers with the same kind of excitement for this. And no one saying, no, you're too young to do this. You've got to pay your dues before you start putting together collections or whatever. There was just this really kind of invigorating feeling there. So I think that was the first time where I really kind of felt like same kind of feeling of like, I am a poet. And at that point, like I had published chapbooks, I had published work in journals, but I think it was the first time that I really felt like I had the capability to put together a collection. Now what I'm struggling with is that I've done one, do I have it in me to do another? That's something apparently everyone deals with, is I'm feeling a little bit like I've...
Saul says, just keep them coming. And
yeah.
I think, Bob, don't you have something to tell us about?
What's
Impact
that?
Statement?
Pardon?
Don't you have a new book?
Oh, yeah, I do have a new book, number 5 for poetry, because I've written nonfiction as well. But approach it, at least I always approached it, and this would be my advice to anybody who is, including me, who's sitting with one book or more published and wondering what to do next. Approach it from the point of view of writing poems. I'm writing a bunch of poems.
Yeah.
And because the minute you lock yourself into writing a book, that's a whole different set of parameters.
It's pretty daunting sitting down to try to write a book. And that's been
right.
a little bit stifling, but I love that idea though of just go back to poems and just write poems. And if they turn out to be a book, great.
Perfect.
If not,
yeah, absolutely.
and that's okay too. At least I wrote a bunch of poems. So thank you
right
for
now,
that.
I'm not writing anything that comes even anywhere near close to a poem.
Okay.
But that's okay too.
Yeah.
Because the book that I've got deserves a little time of its own before I try to overtake it with something else.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
And its impact statement, which I understand is love poetry book.
I have said that I did a lot of school visits up to about 2 or 3 years ago. No, more than that. I guess it would be 5 or 6 years ago. And then my life took some curves I didn't expect, and I had to stop. But one of the things that I like to do would be to go into a high school class, grade 11 or grade 12, and we invariably got to talk about love poems, and I would horrify them by saying that I'd only ever written 2 love poems in my life, both to the woman who's now my wife, and both, neither of which had the word love in them anywhere. And then I would embarrass the hell out of them by asking, what color is love? And what's it taste like? And all of those, embarrassing questions when you're 16 or 17 or maybe 18, and you think you know what love is.
Yeah,
So with
absolutely.
this book of poems that I've got now is a book of poems written about my reactions to things that happened to my wife. In 2013, she had embolisms which traveled from her, or blood clots traveled from her leg into her lungs and put her on the ground.
That's terrible. Frightening.
Before they got her out of the parking lot, her heart stopped 4 times.
Oh, geez.
And they got her to the hospital, and she obviously survived, but we went through a great deal of trauma in the process.
Naturally.
And so, these poems are poems which I wrote in reaction to the things that were happening to her. But there is one poem, the last poem in the book, is the only poem in the book that uses the word love anywhere in it. And yet, when you look at the collection as a whole, I think it is a book of love poems. Because
Awesome.
if I hadn't loved my wife, I probably wouldn't have bothered writing any of the poems.
True. Very true. I'm just going to go back briefly before I've got a couple more questions for our panelists. So, Sandy, you've got that crossing point where you crossed over into the poetry zone. Can you describe that?
Well, I, crossing over might not be a very good description, because it was more or less a conscious, I wonder if I can write a poem, because I was also trying to write monologues and short stories and flash fiction, and trying out a lot of these different things, and discovered that I liked, the poetry was kind of a neat thing. So I have not, and probably will never have, a collection of my poems, because I'm also writing in a more Celtic style. So there may be 2 or 3 lines that are very similar, and then one line that is different. And they're also, as I say, telling a story for the most part. What I may end up doing is putting out a collection of the combination of, here's the poem version of this story, here are actual short stories of that sort of reflect that same idea. One of them is about the wild hunt, and what, the poem is about the wild hunt and what can happen, which is usually a very bad thing, when you encounter the white stag or the white doe in the woods in Britain. They're actually set in fairly early Britain, and what happens then. And I actually have 2 different short story versions, although one's bordering on novella length, of that same thing. You encounter the wild hunt, and you encounter the white stag, or in the other case, the white doe, and what happens. So that's more the kind of collection I would do, because how I'm writing poetry and what their content is. So I don't think I actually crossed over. I sort of wandered over that way, and now I've wandered back, and it's back and forth type of thing.
Right. And all of this really is a style of voice, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's all writing, but in different formats, obviously. I mean, you've got playwriting and poetry writing and fiction writing and, creative nonfiction writing and speculative fiction. One of the questions that we have here is, are any of you speculative poets?
Yep.
Yeah.
Shawn? Oh, sorry, Amy, go ahead.
I could touch on it a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, that's not a term that I'm entirely familiar with, but it totally fits. I would consider myself a speculative poet. So this is my collection that just came out right when COVID hit. And what I did with this collection, and what I tried to do with a lot of my writing, is kind of that crossover between prose and poetry, and the crossover between poetry and story, because they're not that different from one another. So a lot of the poems that I wrote kind of play with like fairy tales and folklore and monstrosity, and these kind of fantasy elements as well. because I think about like what I love to read for speculative fiction, and I kind of try to take that and put it into poetry form. So yeah, I would definitely consider myself a speculative poet, and I love that phrase. I'm going to use that now. That might go on my business cards when I finally get some.
Speculative poet.
Speculative poet.
No italicized being required.
No, exactly. But I love that because what I've always felt with poetry is that there's such an opportunity for story in poetry, and for reading more into it than even sometimes what the author put there, because it's that partnership between the author and the reader. I know for me, when I sit down and read a poem, I want to be told a story. I kind of go back to childhood where I'm like, tell me something interesting. So yeah, I really love that phrase. Yeah. Also, I think someone in the questions just asked what the name of my book was. It's called I Know Something You Don't Know. And it just came out with Gordon Hill Press in March. But there's links to it on the author's table. I could type that into the chat as well.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, Amy.
Yeah.
And congratulations. That's honestly awesome.
Thank
we
you so much.
We have a couple more questions here. They're just stacking in. So do you find that you follow a certain style for writing poetry? Do you change it up? Do you break rules to suit your own creativity? This is from Tammy. Who wants to respond first?
Well, yeah, I think you break some rules, but if you're going to break rules, you've got to know what the rules are and why they're there before you start breaking them. I had to learn that the hard way. But I think my style, my poetry is all free verse. But I think it's all pretty much storytelling, I guess, in one way or another. But it took me about 10 years to find the voice that I use now for my poetry. And I thrashed around doing all kinds of things. But eventually my poetic voice emerged. And I think, quite frankly, it had help from a number of people, including a poet by the name of but
Sorry, who was the
once
poet?
I had that, pardon?
You froze up. We got the computer voice for just a moment. What's the poet's name?
Richard Harrison.
Richard Harrison. Okay.
Yeah. But I think that once I've got my poetic voice, then I don't muck around with it very much. It is my poetic voice. And I think if you were to look at my poems through the 5 books that I've got, you'd be able to say, yep, those all sound like Bob Stallworthy poems, which is fine. I mean,
Anybody else want to respond to the question?
I'll say that my style is quite short. Most of I follow this model of brevity as an art. So I like to be very focused. I have lots of poems that are quatrains. I have my poetry book here, and I'm just skimming through it, and like you can see how long the poems are, right? Like there's not a lot of gigantic poems in there. And you look at somebody like Shane Koizan or something, or even Patrick Lane, they write these really long block texts that are the really long poems that become quite long in narrative. Felicia Rusno is another one who does quite long poetry. And mine are really short. But some of them are long. So, and I play with my high school students. I'm a high school English teacher in my regular life. And my specialty is creative writing for obvious reasons. And so I have all the creative writing classes. And so we do Poetry Friday, every Friday. And I teach them all the forms, and we play with all the forms, but then we break all the forms. And so short, long, poetic voice. I think it changes. And I think like I will approach one poem, one idea one way with a certain poetic voice in mind, and I will approach something else with a completely different voice. Which makes it interesting when I'm coming to the end. We were talking earlier about compiling collections for a book. And what I tend to do is read through all of the hundreds of poems on my blog and pick the best ones in that year or 2 year span, and then tweak those a little bit, make sure they're even better, and then release those. So I don't write for a collection. I come back afterwards and say, which were the ones that got the most responses, which were the ones that seemed to connect with the most people, which ones do I personally love the most, and ditch the rest. So the poetic voice switches all through those.
So we're going to jump in with another question because we're just tripping along here on time. So many poetry books are themed, and the award winners all seem to explore some central subject. How do you reconcile this with just writing poems?
Well,
oh, go ahead, Bob.
just writing poems, I guess. Sometimes there's a theme that emerges from those poems. Shawn was talking about, going back to her blog and pulling the ones that seem to get the most response or of whatever as a way to start to put a collection together. And I don't think every book of poems has to have a theme. Most of mine do, but that's simply because the theme emerged, or in the case of this one, it was written about a specific kind of incident. But certainly I wouldn't stop writing or not put a collection together simply because there was no theme. If you've got poems which go together nicely, go for it.
Yeah, as I said, my collection will be the poems and the short stories that are there, and very likely they will all be on a Celtic theme. That would be the unifying thing. But that's because what I do. Other than the few odd other poems, they don't really have. There's not another theme that's as prevalent as the sort of the general Celtic one. So
I'd kind of like to see you get that collection together and get it published, because I think the mixture of poetry and short stories is a great idea.
Yeah, well, I need to actually get some more of the short stories that go with the poems actually together, and some of them are right now out trying to find the short story is trying to find a home to see if I can do that. It is very hard getting sort of this. I guess now it's experimental poetry because it's a very old form. I was fortunate enough to have Polar Borealis has printed 2 of my poems, and there's a 3rd one coming up. And actually, the first one, which was actually a horror poem written in sort of the Celtic style, was nominated for the 2018 Aurora. So I'm hoping my more recent one, Giants Dance, which is in number 13, I think it is, it came out in January. And that's also a very Celtic, it's a very Celtic poem. It's about about Stonehenge and all the other henges.
So the message I'm
how
getting
they're connected.
Oh, sorry, Sandy. The message I'm getting seems to be, find your groove, the thing that makes you happy, and write about that. Because, I mean, some of it, if you're just trying to fit a marketplace, you're not really writing from your core honest self, right? So then it's not not going to be as productive or as real. Somebody has asked here, what is a good career trajectory for good goals to aim for a poet? And I'm just guessing that commit to submit, would that be the first ticket?
Yep.
And finding a home. There's a number of conferences. This is probably one of the better ones. Like When Words Collide, I found has been a true harbor and a safe place to launch ideas and get feedback. And I want to say, Shawn, that your prompt poetry panel was amazing, and hoping you could show us your book cover there for prompting for ideas for novelists and for poets. And one of the poems that came out of that was really amazing. I was just astounded that, out of the prompt poetry, that there was such a great collaboration there. And also, I think finding a book that would be similar to what you would like to publish. I do recall at one point walking into like a Chapters bookstore and just looking to see what a book of poetry would look like in hand, so to speak. And Amy, I was wondering, can you tell me about your first chapbook?
Sure. So my first chapbook, I don't have a copy with me immediately, but it was published by Loft on 8th Press, which is the micro press that runs out of Loft 112, which is a really fabulous creative hub in Calgary, in the East Village. I can put links to it in the chat because I was telling Jennifer the other day, it's just a great place to get to know writers, a great place to get some support and some ideas and some workshopping in. So this was part of their Long Lunch Quick Reads program 3 years ago now, it's 2017. And you get to print a tiny chapbook and you get 25 free copies and you get to host a lunch and a launch on a Friday afternoon for yourself and your friends. So it's just a really nice experience. It was a lovely first kind of launch, I guess, into publishing something that was more than just an individual piece. So I had that one. I published another chapbook that ultimately became the full-length collection. And then I have another chapbook that's going to be coming out later in 2021. I don't know, from the career trajectory standpoint, I'm early in my career, so I'm answering this as a baby poet. But what I quite liked was submitting individual pieces for publication in magazines and journals, moving those into clusters of poems to start submitting as chapbooks or self-publishing as chapbooks, and then kind of moving from there into the full collection. And what I really liked about that, it's not to say that that's the way it has to be. I found that worked for me. And what I really liked about that was that you could have a cluster of poems that you knew was good. You could have something that had worked as a chapbook and got accepted and was read and people liked it. And then that's kind of the core of where the next collection came from for me. So that was kind of the trajectory that I followed. And like Bob, with your advice, that's kind of what I'm hoping to do again, is kind of start at the beginning and publish individual poems, put them in a chapbook, start extending that out into a longer work and kind of see what happens there and see what directions it takes me. But yeah, honestly, just this commit to submit, just send work out. I had a year where I had 137 rejections, and I felt really good about that because that meant I submitted a lot of work and I probably had 10 pieces accepted that year. So
that's amazing. So that's great. It is a numbers game. Okay, guys, we're getting close, but we still have time. There's another question came up. Do you self-publish or do you go through a publisher? And is there any preference?
For me, there is a preference. I have done some self-publishing. I self-published 2 chapbooks. I would prefer to go through a regular publisher. I know a lot of people don't. I'm old enough, and I started long enough ago that I am not all that enamored of self-publishing. I think that let me put it this way. If you're going to self-publish, please hire yourself an editor to have them, him, her, it, whatever, go through your stuff and be as hard on it as they want to be. You want to put the best book you can out there. And I don't think I've ever published anything without an editor. And I think that it really isn't, I can see Amy nodding her head. I think it really is important, even if you're going to self-publish. Hire an editor, a good one, and have
Even
them
for
go through
poetry.
it. Pardon?
Even for poetry.
Absolutely.
I would even say especially for poetry.
Yeah, exactly. Can I make one other comment too, just to go back to your previous question about a trajectory? My only comment on that really would be, don't be in a hurry. Don't let anybody stampede you into sending stuff out before you're ready, asking, just take your time. You want to send the best out that you've got.
Don't bloom until the sun is in the top of the peak.
If you keep at it, you'll bloom, and you don't have to worry about it.
And the time
Yeah,
will come. So, Amy, a
I would
question for
also
you.
actually,
sorry.
I would, for looking for an editor, you need to find one who understands poetry, not necessarily just any editor who happens to, that you might work with for your stories, for your novel. Because otherwise you're not quite, they may not understand what you're trying to do or how you're trying to do it, and go, oh no, you're all of this is wrong, and you're like, no. So being
Don't get
cautious.
the bad editor. Okay, noted.
Yeah, well,
Amy, question. The pieces that you include in your chapbooks, are these pieces that were accepted individually by magazines and other places?
So the answer to that would be sometimes. Probably there's no hard and fast statistic about this, but probably I'm thinking for my first two chapbooks, probably about 50% of the poems in there had been published in magazines or journals. If that is something you're looking at, just make sure that you always clear it with whoever published it first. You should always own the rights to your own work. If a magazine gets it, they have first publication rights. So they have the right to having it appear before anybody else, but it's still your work. So you should be able to reproduce it. They might have a time limit on how long they want exclusive rights on it. But I don't know, that was the way for me, having certain pieces in there that had been published that gave me confidence in what I was putting into the chapbook. And that there were pieces that had already been accepted. Somebody had told me they liked it or something. Because I don't know, I would feel really anxious if I were putting a fully brand new chapbook out there with nothing that had ever been published before. I'm sure people do it. For my comfort level, I would probably be a big ball of nerves on something like that. So it's kind of like putting the toe in the water, because sometimes pieces just don't get picked up as well. And I have poems that I've beaten to death trying to get accepted somewhere, and then eventually they kind of just get tucked into the drawer, and that's okay. But it's nice to get that external feedback before putting it into a chapbook, which is pretty high stakes when you're sending it out. It's nice to have some kind of idea of how it'll be received before you're sending it out as a full thing.
I would say that also, you mentioned working, doing the workshops in Banff, and I mentioned in the chat that I had been pitching poetry to Howard White, who's the publisher of Douglas and McIntyre, and he said that my blog has so many followers and I get so much response on my blog that it's almost pointless for them to put out something because I have more feedback and more visibility on the blog. But I said that, where would you recommend for more skill and strategy and whatever? And he sent me to the Honeymoon Bay Poetry Retreat, which is run by a lady called Liz McNally. And for many, many years, it's been 2 sessions with Lorna Crozier. She does a January one and a fall one sometime, October, I think, and Patrick Lane in the summer. So I went one year for my birthday weekend. I went and I did a $1,000 poetry workshop with Governor General award-winning poet Patrick Lane. And sitting around that room with those 30-odd poets who were very, very serious poets. Poet laureate of New Westminster was there. The quality of the work, and then the feedback, the very, very specific feedback, because we would be given an assignment and then we would read our resulting piece, and he would do like masterclass feedback of every one of the poems as we went. And that feedback, not just on your own poem, but what you're hearing on everybody else's, is worth it. And you come back with this whole other understanding of what a good poem looks like. You know, like he'll listen to you read this 1-page thing and he'll say, well, the whole poem is really in the last 5 lines. And you look at it and go, oh, yeah, okay. Off goes the top, you know, cut off their heads. And it was astonishing how often he could just, like, you know, boil it down. So part of that is an editor who understands poetry, right? A professional poet understands poetry, or those kind of workshopping experiences with people who are phenomenal at their job and have some talent, real talent. It's humbling and amazing, and the creativity just is crazy. I highly endorse that possibility of doing that kind of masterclass.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, here we guys, we're almost at the wrap-up point. We've got about 2 minutes left, 7 if we really push it. Bob, any final words? I mean, the best part for me was don't rush. What else have you got for us?
Well, I think that's one of the most important things is take your time. As John was suggesting, take some workshops. That's what I did. I'm still in one. I'm in a good one. You know, don't be afraid to ask for some help, and don't be afraid to listen to the criticism that you get. Because they are, you know, have some substance to them. That's nice, dear, doesn't do you any good. But you know, if you can get some people around you who can give you some fair comment, go for it.
And Sandra?
Keep writing and keep looking for places where you can send your work. And if you get a rejection that just says, we reject it, you know, like, yeah, whatever. But if you get one that actually has some comments, do pay attention to what they've said. It may not make sense to you, or when you go back and look at the poem or the story or whatever, you may go, oh, that's something, you know, okay, right. And then find somewhere else to send it, because nobody's going to read it if you don't submit it somewhere or publish it somewhere.
Commit to submit. Shawn, last words?
No, he's right. Yeah, get it out, put your words out there. Write lots of them. You get better by doing.
Amy?
I suppose the last thing I would say, and I just put this in the chat, is if you ever have the opportunity to work with a literary journal or a magazine or a publisher, it's a really eye-opening experience, because you get to see how many good pieces just don't get accepted because they're either not the right fit, or they're too long, or there's just so many other circumstances that sometimes you're sending out really brilliant work and it's just looking for the right home. And I found working with literary journals helped me kind of realize that, like, there's a couple hundred submissions that come in and we can only take 3, and yours was number 4. So it's nice to know sometimes that you're writing really good work. It's just a matter of finding the best home for it, but keep faith that that home is going to be there, because it does come. And if you get 137 rejections in a year, you committed, so it's good.
Paper your bathroom walls with them. Then your guests will have something to read.
Yeah. No, I'm going to make a collage someday. I have them all. I'm going to make a rejection collage.
Absolutely.
Okay, guys. Well, thank you. This is so much amazing information and lots to think on and lots of great websites here and some poems to check out. And just a reminder, this is all being recorded and it will be uploaded eventually. Don't expect it in the first day or two. There's 5 tracks of panels over 3 days, amazing days. And don't forget, we've got a dead dog party tonight. If you missed the ghost stories last night, you really missed out. It was so much fun. Just because we're at home doesn't mean we can't have fun. So guys, I want you to stay safe. Thanks so much for coming out to check out When Words Collide. And you are a poet, you just didn't know it. So give it a go, keep writing, and do try and find a home for that lovely poem of yours, and do not give up. And my favorite adage is the same one I tell my kids: I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. Yes, I can. So thank you guys so much for all your amazing information, and also for taking the time and volunteering and helping us out with everyone's birth of a poet. So Bob, best of wishes. Amy, thank you again. Shawn, really amazing. Nice to meet you. And Sandra, thank you so much for giving us all those tips and tricks. We need them all, everybody. Keep well, stay safe, and carry on. Thanks so much,
Thanks
guys.
very
So much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.